Welcome to the ClassicalU podcast. I'm Jesse Hake. I'm the director at ClassicalU. ClassicalU is a subsidiary of Classical Academic Press, a curriculum and monograph publishing company. At ClassicalU, we provide training for teachers and parents interested in learning more about classical education, how to deliver this method in your classrooms, in your homes. I mostly spend time talking with presenters and live learning event guests, and we look forward to sharing more with you as you tune in. Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for being on the show with ClassicalU. It's been very wonderful having you and your husband here as you're recording this week with ClassicalU course that is on art and archaeology, teaching Latin through specific sites in Rome. And we're so excited about that, as well as some material on the Aeneid. I know you've just completed a master's degree at Edinburgh. That's an exciting new stage in your life, opening up new opportunities and questions. And that's a Master of Science with distinction in classical art and archaeology. You've been serving for several decades, really since early in the renewal, Grace Academy in Georgetown, Texas, teaching Latin there and as chair of their Latin program. Also a Classical Academic Press author, contributing to really the lead author in our Latin Alive series and contributing to the History Reader in Latin, in the Latin for Children series that we have. And also with a new kind of project underway that's still in development, but very exciting to hear about, and I hope to talk about in another episode with you, the Tournament of Laurels, and offering a chance for students and schools to sign up for Latin competitions, Latin events that would be kind of an alternative complement to the Junior Classical League events. And so thank you so much. I would love to start out by asking, referring to the fact that you've been writing and teaching in the classical renewal really since the beginning. We use the term classical renewal or movement. It's only been a couple of decades in the United States now, relatively young in many ways. But as someone who's seen kind of the story unfolding from the beginning, what would be some key insights and wisdom for parents on the one hand, teachers on the other hand, considering classical education for their students? What are some strong points? What are some things to watch out for? Or teachers, considering a career change or just nearing the end of their college and thinking, is this a direction that I would want to go in? Some tips for them.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for having me, Jesse. It's always good to be here. Having worked with CAP for the number of years that I have, you all are wonderful friends and family. And so it's always just a great opportunity to be here in Pennsylvania, especially when it's so hot in Texas. It's a really nice escape. So always a delight. That is a very broad question, but at the same time, as you know, I fit into all of those categories in addition to the work that you have so kindly mentioned in my introduction. I'm also the mother of 3 students who attended a classical Christian school, Grace Academy, kindergarten through 12th grade, and who are all now, 2 of them have now successfully completed university. One of them actually returning to teach in a classical Christian school, and the youngest will be concluding her senior year. Wow. So again, we've seen so much change over the past couple decades as well. So I guess to speak to the first question, looking into a classical Christian school, every school has its highs and its lows, its ups and its downs, because no place is perfect. And yet I think within a classical Christian school, hopefully as members of the Christian faith, we're also humble enough to see that and always strive towards pursuing excellence and trying to better ourselves. I think, when we talk about classical Christian education, the first thing we always think of is the curriculum, what we're teaching. And certainly there is some excellence to be pursued in that. I know for my own students, my own children who are former students, I should say, as they have ventured into university years, they've had their they've had their joys in their experiences, and they've had their critiques and their criticisms. And as they've gone into university and beyond, they've been able to look back. And while they can fully recognize the things that were less than wonderful and were difficult, the positives have been, thankfully, the positives have outshone those. And they will talk quite a bit about the preparation that kind of education gave them for university and for career. And all of that, I think, really hinges back on studying the great texts and having the opportunity to read books such as the Aeneid, which you mentioned earlier, and Homer's works, but seeing how they then inspire other writers. We talk about Augustine, we talk about Dante and Milton and Shakespeare and the philosophers, the Boethius and Plato, and all of these many wonderful names in these great books. And they're taught to approach them with a critical eye and an appreciation. One of my sons, I can remember in, I believe it was in high school, was not the greatest fan of poetry. And I remember having a conversation with him then, and him saying, I don't like poetry, but I'm learning to appreciate poetry. And I said, that's fair. I'm happy with you just appreciating poetry. But then as he was studying his degree he was at Texas A&M University, and he was studying a course in the epics, the great epics, Iliad, Odyssey, Argonauts, Aeneid, even went down to the Christiad. And this was at the same time that I was studying in Edinburgh. And the conversations that we had were so rich. Here's my son, who at one point in time had said, I really just don't like the poetry, Mom. And particularly he was talking about some of the early medieval and the classical. And it's not easy reading, I understand.
Yep.
But here he is, not only taking this class of his own volition, but finding the beauty in it, loving it, and recommending things to me in it. To the point where at one point in time I'm writing a paper on sculpture. It was on the Sperlonga group, which appears in our ClassicalU course. And I was looking for a particular source to connect Sextus Pompey to this particular statue. And Matthew says to me, Mother, have you looked at Lucan's Civil War? I think that would be a good resource for you. And I have to say, in that moment, I'm sitting in the library at Edinburgh reading this text exchange, and my heart is overflowing. And so there are moments of struggle for us as parents and as teachers. And we're working with a vase here that we're trying on the parent side and also on the teacher side. And hopefully in the ideal classical Christian school, the parents and the teachers are working on that shaping together. We're smoothing out the rough spots. And maybe this particular teacher doesn't handle something well, or this particular assignment is difficult, or this particular relationship with a friend is going through a rough spot. But that's part of life. That's part of challenge. That's part of the beauty and the difficulty that come together and shape us. And so knowing those highs and lows from the teacher view and from the parent view, to see in my own children and then some of my other former students how that has shaped them and the man or woman of God that they're becoming, I will not dare to be so arrogant to say it's all because of classical Christian education. But I also know, and I say this humbly, that God used that to help me as teacher, to help me as parent in shaping and preparing these students for whatever calling God has for them. And that's what Timothy, I believe it's in is it 1 Timothy 3:17, that Paul writes to Timothy and says, all the scripture that you've learned, this has all been about shaping you, all been about equipping you. And that, I think, is our mission and our goal. And I think I would say to parents, if you're looking for a place to come alongside you to help educate your children whom God has entrusted to you, first of all, remember God has entrusted them to you, not to the teacher, not to the administrator. They're your responsibility. So you want to find a school, a program that's going to come alongside you, with whom you can work with in a positive relationship to help shape and craft your student, knowing that you really don't know what that path is that God has for them. You might think it's this or that occupation. And certainly as a parent, I can say it was fun to kind of play that guessing game. Oh, I see this talent. I see that. What is God going to do here? But it's also just so fun in this stage to see my children, now adults, spreading their wings and soaring, and to look back and see how God used the strengths in those schools and even some of the unpleasant challenges in those schools to shape them. and prepare them for the path they're walking now. So I would say that's the first takeaway.
Yeah, that's a deeply personal kind of, I don't want to say transformative. I mean, a lot of us have stories of really kind of personal transformation, spiritual blessing, in connection to our work with classical Christian education. But you're talking about a kind of, deep flourishing, that you've had the privilege of witnessing, not as a result, as you say, of everything being perfect or classical education being the only or the most critical factor, but as a part of the mix, you've seen this beautiful mother-son, relationship, the specific example you gave unfold. Yeah, thank you. So to the teachers, those, young college, about to be college grads, someone, maybe in a career, they've heard all this stuff from friends or wherever it might be about classical Christian education. We have a good number of examples of people who are moving from college teaching to teaching in a classical Christian K-12 school. Any words of warning or advice or encouragement to potential teachers?
Sure. I recall talking to one educator, actually I think it's probably more than one, who said to me early on that the key to a great teacher is to love students first, to be passionate about their subject area, their discipline second, and to above all else love and honor God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think that so aptly sums that up. We need to love our students beyond, as we do with parents too, right? We love our students, we love our children, and with a point of grace and a point of mercy. I always tell teachers, you don't know what's happening for that student at home. So when they come home, when they come to school and they are having a bad day or an off day or the work's not quite up to snuff, I think all too often we as teachers will jump to taking that at face value. So remember, we don't know what's going on behind the curtain, which is why we should always also be open with parents. And I think that's one of the beautiful elements of our classical Christian schools, that oftentimes we really build this relationship in partnering with parents and say, hey, Johnny did great on this paper. It's his best work yet. Parents need that encouragement. Please start out the year by pointing out the good things you see in those students. And then when you say, I noticed Johnny's having a bad week. Is everything okay? Is there something I can help with? Or sometimes if a parent comes in with a parent conference and has a concern, always being very open to say, Mrs. Smith, here's what I'm seeing. Please help me understand what you're seeing so that we can partner together to provide your child the best education possible, or to help them get over this bump in the road, if there's a bump in the road. So I think that's one thing, that's loving the student. I think we need to make sure that students see how much we love what we teach. I have had students, and I say this with all humility, who've said, I'm choosing to take Latin again next year when it gets to the point of being an elective. Sometimes it's required, sometimes it's an elective. Not because I like Latin so much, but because I really enjoy Mrs. Moore's class. That's the kind of response I want. So I want to we talk about bringing Latin alive, but I want them to see how excited I get, how much joy it brings me to see a particular way that Virgil writes a line of a poem. Or, for example, with this Art and Archaeology course, this is the reason I went to Edinburgh to study this. And I came back telling the students this. I wanted to go study where written texts lined up with material evidence. That is, I want to stand in Rome and say, hey, let's look at the Ark of Titus. And do you realize all the history that this arch is telling us, and these texts that talk about it? Or the same thing about a particular statue or a monument. And I think that you don't just have to go to Rome to do that. These are things we can bring into our classroom to do that. And to bring that excitement, that love, that passion, and that will change students' minds. Do you know, I actually began my study in Latin at 7th grade, and that was because my mother made me. And I was really disappointed. I had put French first on my choice sheet and German second because I wanted to be a ballerina and I had German relatives, and Latin third, and only because my mother just would not relent on how much I should take Latin. But I had teachers who shared their passion, and I began to see their passion for Latin, their excitement for Latin. And my mother teases me, yes, I made you take it, Karen, but it was just supposed to be for a couple of years. And here I've gone quite beyond that. But I want to share that passion with my students. And I don't expect them all to become classicists, but as my son came to a place of appreciating poetry, I want them to come to a place of appreciating the value of Latin, the beauty of Latin, the benefit of Latin, not just in their English vocabulary, but in so many areas. And that's a whole other talk, as you know. And then as far as just, loving the Lord, we want to teach these things from a Christ-centered view. And that means not that Jesus' name has to be invoked in every lesson, but be willing to step back and say, Lord, what can I see of you and your hand in creation and history in this moment? And how can I help bring that before my students? And how, Lord, can I let them see you in me as your light? Christ tells his disciples, let your light shine before men. Lord, how can my light shine to bless them and to glorify you? And that comes through an attitude of humility that we must always work through, I think, especially on the days when it's hard and it's long, right?
Yep.
Getting on our knees and saying, Lord, use me. I am your vessel.
Yeah. Thank you. What was your son studying at Texas A&M? Because it sounds like he's an example of, and a story that I've heard many times, a student who is, pursuing one field of study and career, but continues to love, the arts, literature.
Sure. So my son, I have 3 children, and 2 of them are Aggies. I am a Longhorn, so that's another interesting story. But I don't think there's ever been a Longhorn more proud of 2 Aggies than I am of my sons. And all 3 of them, I see them carrying their classical education forward. So the eldest is an engineer, and he graduated with a great degree in multidisciplinary engineering. But he leads C.S. Lewis book studies through his church and loves those. And I sit back and I watch how he's teaching those, and I see the imprints of his classical education on him. The middle one, Matthew's the one I've been talking about, and he pursued a degree in political science with a minor in history.
Okay.
And he is hoping to go to law school, but he said, I really want to take time to give back. He said, I see what this classical education did for me. I see where I am compared to some of my peers, and they were really shortchanged. So I want to go back and take some time to give back as I prayerfully consider what the next step is. And then my youngest is pursuing a degree in psychology and Christian counseling. And with her as well, she's in the honors college at Houston Christian University. And to see her thrive and carry her classical Christian education further has been a blessing. And she also was one who was giving me tips during my studies at Edinburgh. It helped me on my dissertation significantly, actually. So it's really fun to see that come full circle as a mother.
Yeah. No, that's a blessing. So you fell in love with Latin, specifically in 7th grade. Right out of the gate. You were forced initially, but really quickly the teachers won your heart over. What specifically was your, how did you hear about classical Christian education, and what was your journey? Where did you come from, and how did you end up teaching and involved with classical Christian education?
Well, that is a fun story, and it is a story of love and romance, Jesse. So
very best.
Yes, it truly is. I will not go Jane Austen, though. My present husband, then fiancé, had purchased a diamond engagement ring from a private seller who happened to be a mother whose children attended Regent School of Austin. So after I said yes to the ring and the man, we went back to her to talk about the wedding rings and such and such. And so, of course, she asks me, I'm still at school at the University of Texas at Austin, a classics major. This was my undergraduate. She says, so what are you studying at UT Austin? And so I tell her Latin, and she says, oh, well, and she starts to tell me about Regent School of Austin. And of course, this idea of students starting Latin in 3rd grade and studying these great texts was immediately tantalizing to me. So she actually put me in touch with Nancy Donaldson, and I did some teaching for Regents in my time at UT Austin, and then actually a little bit after I had graduated, but then took a hiatus to have children. When Michael, our eldest, came up to about school age, I began wrestling with the question every parent wrestles with at that age, and that's, what are we going to do for school? And Regents had continued to move south in Austin, and we continued to move north. We're in Georgetown, as you mentioned at the beginning, and that's quite a bit north. So one day I'm driving down the road and really praying to the Lord, where do I send Michael to school? Where do we go? And Lord, I really just need a Regents here in Georgetown, meaning, of course, a classical Christian education. And not 2 days later, I'm sitting on the bench with the coach's wife at my son's little 5-year-old soccer practice and said to her, where do your children go to school? And she said, oh, we found the most wonderful little school. We love it. It's a classical Christian school. You probably don't know what that is. And I said, well, actually, I used to teach at Regents. And she knew the name of the school. Wow. So her jaw kind of dropped and said, well, what did you teach? And I said, Latin. And her jaw dropped again. And she said, just 2 days before, the same day I was praying, they were praying for a Latin teacher because theirs had quit. So immediately goosebumps, and I go home and I say, Brian, this is too strange not to be God. We need to look into this. And the rest, as they say, is history. Wow. And that's where I still am.
Great. Thank you. The your master's degree work in Edinburgh, what you've talked a little bit about it, but what were some of the highlights in the content itself? You know, what specifically were you did you end up writing about in your thesis work, and what stood out to you there?
Certainly. The reason I chose this particular program, as you said, in Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, is that I knew for years I really wanted to pursue grad school at some point once our children were out of school at Grace Academy. But I was wanting to figure out which direction I wanted to go. I really wanted to pursue the study of material evidence alongside Latin texts. And the program at Edinburgh was one of the few places I could do that. I'd had a bit of a taste in 2017. I went on a study tour for Latin teachers with the Virgilian Society, led by Dr. Steve Tuck, who had a PhD in classical art and archaeology. So that's where I thought, oh, that's a thing. And the most memorable experience there was standing at the Sibyl's Cave in Cumae, which Virgil so beautifully describes in Book 6. Yeah. And to me, that is Latin coming to life. I'm walking through this cave, walking through the mouths and the openings where the winds would blow through, as Virgil writes. And I thought, yes, this resonates within me. This is what I want to pursue. As Lewis says, farther up, farther in. I just wanted more of that. And my husband was just phenomenal. He said, I see this in you. I see this as God's calling. This is your gifting. This is the next step. And so together we pursued this opportunity. And at this university, their history, classics, and archaeology are all in one department. So it's very easy to integrate between all those disciplines. So some of the research I did, for example, in the fall, I took a Roman archaeology class. And my research work for that particular class was writing a paper on the houses of Herculaneum and how Vitruvius's work from De Architectura compares with that. And that had been, Herculaneum is a site that I have visited multiple times. I knew it well. I've taken students there. And so to trace his work and his designs for housing and see how well they complemented that was a great deal of fun. And then in the spring, I took a course on Roman sculpture. And there were other courses too, but this was, again, one of the highlights, a course in Roman sculpture. And my paper there was looking at the Sperlonga group and the Laocoon statue, both of which are mentioned in the ClassicalU course, and the literature and the history that pertains to them and even shows perhaps the influence behind their design. And that, I just absolutely loved that. I have to say, my mother, my sister, my cousin are all artists. I do not have that talent through my fingers, but I have a deep love and appreciation for it. So to look at beauty next to my lovely Latin poetry is happiness And I thoroughly enjoyed that. But then for my dissertation, I went in a very different direction. It was not the direction I intended, but I also had just prayed and said, Lord, I'm stepping out on this adventure and I'm just trusting you, guide me. Well, in the fall, another favorite course was Latin literature pertaining to the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and particularly Latin literature of the antique period. So we were reading Jerome, Augustine, Ambrose, Cassiodorus, all of these wonderful works. And I was introduced to Victorinus, who is a forerunner of Augustine, and was introduced to his work. And he is the first to write Latin commentaries on the scriptures, particularly the Pauline epistles. And so I wrote one paper comparing his work with that of Jerome and Augustine on the commentary for Galatians in the fall, and enjoyed that so much that I picked up his commentary in Philippians for the dissertation and wrote on his exploration of suffering and salvation in Philippians, in a particular section of that work, which heretofore had not been translated into English. So that was a delightful challenge, one that I relished and that I hope to continue.
That is exciting. Do you have any details as far as the insights into the passages themselves? The dialogue between Jerome or Augustine's reading and his own reading at a kind of commentary level?
Yes, but do you really have time for that?
Just give. Do you have a taste of one example?
And the differences between Augustine, Jerome, and Victorinus?
Yeah.
Yes. Within the confines of a 5,000-word paper, you have to go very narrow and very specific. So I was looking particularly at Galatians 3 and Paul's metaphor for the pedagogus, or the tutor, as a metaphor for the law that trains us. And I wanted to see how each one of them handled that. So the nutshell version is that I could see the background of each one kind of influencing their interpretation of it. Victorinus was the rhetor of Rome. He was a teacher by nature. And so you see him viewing the pedagogus as someone who's guiding towards learning, in the sense that I think we as classical Christian educators want to be, right? Guiding, loving them, ushering them towards learning, preparing them for what comes next. And that's the pedagogus for him. For Jerome, he seemed to have, and from other works, I'm drawing, not specifically, I don't have my notes in front of me, but from other works, he seemed to be viewing the pedagogus more as a taskmaster, a brutal jailer of sorts. And so he had a more negative, restrictive view of that. And for Augustine, we very much saw his monastic influence, how he's writing these as lessons for his monastic brothers. And there was that kind of an influence in his interpretation. And so that was really a delight to see and to explore, and to see the connections too, because it's highly likely that Augustine was looking both at the work of Jerome and the work of Victorinus, both who had already written commentaries before he wrote his own, and you could see him drawing a bit from both.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Is there any place where listeners could find more of your work, or is that forthcoming?
Let's say it's forthcoming, and you and I can talk privately later.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to catch up a little bit, and really appreciate the week of work with you, and sharing very soon, we hope, the ClassicalU content that you've been recording.
Okay. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much for listening to the ClassicalU podcast. Please do check out our website, ClassicalU.com, and our teacher magazine, Altum. We hope you've enjoyed these conversations with presenters and live learning event hosts with ClassicalU.